Another option for sockets in the rear of the Ranger is this purpose-built accessory harness panel. Now you can see we've got 2 Andersons, 2 switches, one that we've wired to power up all of our sockets so we can kill power to them when needed, and one that's left as a spare. So if you have a canopy light, a camping light, you can power off this switch. So let's just show you briefly how this sits into place and how it looks. Now this custom purpose-built panel simply replaces that Ford panel that's been removed and installs a range of 12-volt sockets into that location and switches. So these can all be customized, these round sockets, to choose whichever sockets we would prefer in that combination. So this is our standard electrical panel for the standard Ford Ranger. If you've got a wild track with a genuine Ford roller shutter, the panel comes with an additional switch housing to pop that Ford switch into so that it's still mounted into this panel so that you can control the roller shutter. So those 2 options will be available on the website. Now to power this whole setup, you'll see it's all pre-wired on the back, just powered via an Anderson plug. So to get our power down to the rear, it's simply a heavy duty Anderson harness that runs down from the auxiliary battery, across the engine bay, down the firewall, straight up to there, plugged in, and that's our accessory harness all powered up. So let's go through now and show you how to get an accessory harness through this vehicle. So the first thing we'll do is undo the cable tie that's holding our loom together, and we can throw that cable tie away. So as we unravel the kit, we basically want to lay our harness into position at this moment, keeping in mind that we're going to be connecting to that auxiliary battery. We don't want to make the electrical connections yet. It's a matter of now routing our cable to the rear. So if we lay our cable in basically the route that we want to take through the engine bay. So what I'm going to do now, because I'm going to follow this existing Ford harness here, I'm going to feed the cable up through all of these things, keeping in mind that I want a cable tie to the Ford harness. So I'll feed it up through there. I'll see this little wire here on that plug just behind there, keeping in mind that I want to keep tying to the Ford harness, and just lay that into position at the moment. And just allowing enough length for us to play with over there. So just sitting it there for now. Now the next step is to find the other end of our harness. So I'll lay it out in front of the car. Think of the way that I'm going to route my cable. So I'm thinking I'm going to want a cable tie to this main Ford electrical harness. So I'll make sure I go beside that for a cable tie. And having the same thought in mind as I drop down towards the chassis rail, and there's a Ford harness straight down, and a lot of vehicles will have an electrical harness down here that starts running towards the rear. So let's just thread our cable all the way through. Okay, so now that our cable is pulled through from the engine bay to under the car, continuing to keep in mind that we want to follow things that we can cable tie to. This Ford electrical harness right here, perfect. So going from inside the chassis rail, I just want to follow the electrical harnesses that I can see here, keeping in mind I can cable tie to them. My cable's on the inside of the chassis rail, so the engine side of the chassis rail. So what I want to do is feed it up across the top of the chassis rail, and you'll notice a Ford electrical harness running over the top, and that gets our cable on the outer side of the chassis rail. And then we can start, you can see our electrical harness running around the body mount here. So we just want to keep following that past our Ford harness here towards the rear. Not cable tying anything at the moment, just getting our cable into position. So I've just moved towards the rear now. So right behind the camera is just the rear wheel. Okay, so you can see our Ford electrical harness now starts to duck up towards the top of the body. So what we want to do is follow that up and back over the chassis rail to the inside. We're grabbing our cable like so.
And the reason for that is inside the chassis rail now, we've got a great Ford harness to continue securing to. So you'll see inside now, we have a Ford electrical harness and it runs all the way towards the rear of the vehicle. So we can continue to follow that the entire length. So once again, we're just following that electrical harness over any fuel lines, keeping in mind that we want a cable tie to it later. So we're at the fuel tank now, following over top of the fuel tank, continuing to follow that harness. We've got good access over the chassis rail. I can get my hand right over the chassis rail, continue following that electrical harness towards the rear wheel here. Now just the start of the tub mount, just got to feed it through a little bit till we can grab it at the back of the fuel tank. So you can see the body mount that we just ran the cable over here. So our cable's on the back side of that body mount. So we've got the fuel tank right here, our spring for the rear suspension there. What we want to do is go over this part of the body here, right near the tank filler, because on the inside of this chassis rail, we have a Ford electrical harness again that we can start securing to. So I'm just going to thread my cable up here. So I'm starting to see the cable on the inside of that chassis rail. Okay, so I've got that harness now. I'm going to pull that cable through. Okay, so I've got my cable at the back of the fuel tank now. I'm just going to continue to push that towards the spare tyre. And I can see it's falling down just near the spare tyre. So now I can go move to behind the rear wheel. So grabbing our cable again from under the vehicle, just make sure we go across the top of the chassis rail. Following those Ford electrical harnesses, we want to be on the outside of the chassis rail now. So now that we've routed our cable to behind the rear wheel, the next thing we want to do is remove this panel where we're going to mount our sockets. So just some Torx bits, undo all 4 of these screws. We're looking to fully remove them. And then we can remove that electrical panel. Now we're ready to jump back under, feed our cable up to here, and while we're under there, we'll disconnect the electrical plug for this so that our full panel can come away. Now looking up in between our inner tub wall here and our outer tub wall, we'll see that small cable coming down. So that's the cable we want to disconnect. It goes to a plug here. We want to disconnect that plug, and that'll allow our panel to come out. So just pushing that tab in, pulling our plug to release it. So that's released our electrical panel from inside the tub. Now what we want to do is feed our cable up towards that hole and feed it through into the tub. We can reach up there. So now that we're back in the tub area, we've got our cable up to where we need it. Because we removed this plug, we can actually pull out our electrical panel. So now that we've routed our power to the rear where we have our electrical panel, it's just a matter of connecting our Anderson plugs together to power up the panel. So simply pushing them together. Now what we would suggest is there's a large cable tie in the kit. So just for an extra measure to lock these Andersons together, since they're really never going to come apart, we're just going to put a cable tie around them just to lock them into position. Using a pair of cutters, we'll cut that cable tie off. And now our final step down the back is to just push our cable back into the housing, sit our panel into position, use those bolts that we took out initially from the Ford panel to re-secure our new panel. So now that our accessories have been mounted in the rear, it's time to get under the car and secure our harness all the way back to the auxiliary battery using the cable ties supplied in the kit. We'll see our harness coming straight down in between the inner wall and the outer wall of the tub. So it'll go straight across the top of the chassis rail where we can see that existing Ford electrical harness right near the spare tyre. So right from this point we can start securing our harness into position. I've just left a little bit of slack going up to the electrical panel, just in case we ever need to pull it out in the tub. We have a little bit of play. We don't want to have it super tight that we can't get it out. So just a little bit of slack there. And then I've got my first cable tie on. I'm just going to keep making my way down the Ford electrical harness. From this position, laying behind the rear wheel, I can make it to the fuel tank. So I've used 3 cable ties in that little section. I'm going to cut the tags off them. So now it's time to secure our harness. Laying in front of the rear wheel now, we've got the fuel tank right here. Looking towards the front of the vehicle, we have our harness already laying into position from earlier. So using the cable ties in the kit, we have that Ford harness running in between, or on top of the chassis rail, in between the fuel tank there. So we can see it through the gap. I can feel it. I can get my hand over the chassis rail. There's a lot of room here. So I'm getting into the position where I can see it up there, reaching over with a cable tie, and I can get both hands in there. So I'm placing the cable tie under the Ford harness, grabbing it with my finger, making sure our cable is sitting into place and locking that into position. So there's a cable tie on there. Following that same procedure all the way down. So just putting our harness in against that Ford harness. Once we get to the front of the fuel tank, it's quite accessible. Quite accessible and visible. So here's the front of our fuel tank. Here's our Ford harness. And this is our harness that we laid into position earlier. So you can see it's quite accessible, visible, easy access just to get some cable ties around. Now we're pretty much approaching the passenger seat area now. And you can see this harness heads across to the gearbox, so we can't really follow that anymore. What we do is have our harness, as we placed earlier, sitting across the top, coming to the back side of the chassis rail, or the outer edge of the chassis rail, and then we've got a new Ford electrical harness that we can follow. I'll put a cable tie on there, and then we'll move the camera so you can see where we're talking about. So this is the cable tie I've just put on. So our harnesses come from the inside of the chassis rail to follow this electrical harness on the outside of the chassis rail. Same procedure, just cable tying to it as we go. So now we're facing the front on that electrical harness. It's our front wheel here. So just using more cable ties to route towards the front. Around our body mount here, we have our harness goes into a plastic shroud, so we can go around that plastic shroud. So making sure our cable goes across that body mount there, around the outside. And then in between the mudguard and that body mount, we can see more electrical harnesses. We can reach up and put a cable tie there. It's going to get us nice and secure for our run up the inside of the firewall from the engine bay. So now that we're secure all the way into the bottom of our run up through the firewall, it's just time to cut the tags off all of the cable ties that we've put on. So now we can head up to the engine bay and pull the rest of the cable up. So this is our harness that we've secured underneath the car. Now the next point, and this may change depending on accessories and where everything is in the engine bay, but there's a nice bracket here, a steel bracket that's got a hole in it. So I'm going to put my first cable tie around here. Now just make sure that we stick away from these aircon aluminium lines, anything hot or moving, because we are in the engine bay now, so just be aware of where our cable's sitting, anywhere we can secure it to. So I've got this bracket, that's nice and secure. The next spot I want to aim for is the Ford electrical harness again. So you'll notice there's a little bracket there. We could attach it to that or straight to the Ford harness. I'm just going to put one through that little bracket for starters. And then straight on the harness. And that's just going to help me to sit it where I want it to sit. Once we've got those two secure, we can see our cables coming out here. Still that same Ford electrical harness runs across the entire back of the engine against the firewall there. So we'll just continue securing to that. Depending on the route that we took to get to the rear, we may have a little bit of excess, or we may just have the exact right amount left. So we just want to make sure that if there's any excess, we just follow down and get rid of it by following those existing Ford cables. But in this case, we've come up with a good length to go straight onto our battery connections. And that is actually the final step in this install. So we'll go and cut our cable ties off, and then we'll show you how to make the electrical connections onto your auxiliary battery. Okay, so now it's time to make our electrical connections to the auxiliary battery. So we've already wired up the red arc charger here, so it's just a matter of putting our cables over top of the existing cables. And this may change depending on the battery that you've chosen for your setup. Most deep cycle batteries will have like a stud, an 8mm stud here. So it's just a matter of placing our accessory harness over top of the existing red arc harness, doing up our terminal. Same thing on the positive. And doing that up as well. And the final step is just to secure our fuse holder. So we'll just lay it into position, sit it beside our red arc fuse holder, and just use a couple cable ties to secure that into place next to the existing one. And then just cutting our cable tie tags. And just making sure our harness is sitting nicely into position. Using cable tie if need be to neaten these up. So now that we've made the electrical connections onto the auxiliary battery, we can go down the back and check that we have power to all of our sockets. So there we go, we've fully installed our electrical panel into the rear of the Ford Ranger tub.